Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com. This is Triangulation, episode 271, recorded Monday, October 31st, 2016. Election Security. Triangulation is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers over 1,500 documentaries and nonfiction series from the world's best filmmakers. Get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month. And for our audience, the first 2 months are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/twit and use the offer code TWIT. And by the all-new Basecamp 3. Discover a much calmer, more organized way to work with your team. Try it out free at basecamp.com/twit. It's time for Triangulation, the show where we get together with some of the most interesting people in technology and learn. And I am really excited about this week's episode. It's very timely. As we record it, it's Halloween, October 31st, 1 week and 1 day away from the presidential election in the United States, elections in general in the United States. And joining us, two experts in the challenges of creating a fair election with verifiability and so forth. We've talked to David Dill before. You might have seen him on the new Screensavers this past week. He's a professor of computer science at Stanford University. Actually, should really give you your full title, the Donald E. Knuth Professor. Which is pretty cool. And also an expert in election security, among other things, and a founder of a website we talked about on Saturday, verifiedvoting.org. It's great to have you back, David, for a little bit longer conversation. Thank you.
It's great to be here.
And we learned of David by calling the legendary Ron Rivest. Ron is, of course, the R in RSA. In fact, the R in RC 2, 4, 5, and 6. It stands for Rivest Cipher. Some say Ron's code. Dr. Rivest, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
An expert in crypto. If I'm to believe Wikipedia, you actually have created a voting system some years ago, 10 years ago, called the 3-ballot voting system.
That's correct.
Why, I guess, is the question.
Voting systems are still a fertile area of research, and we need to explore what's possible with cryptography, without cryptography, what kinds of verifiability are possible. And and part of the effort is research, part of it's pedagogical. And the 3-ballot system was an effort to, in pedagogy as much as anything else, it's probably not a terribly practical system because you have to cast 3 ballots every time rather than 1. But in return for that, you get a nice level of verifiability, and it illustrates many of the principles of the style of voting systems that are being explored in some research papers called end-to-end verifiability. I can explain more about that if you like, but it's an interesting suite of proposals that are there. And 3-ballot is just sort of the least crypto-oriented of them and perhaps the most understandable, but it may not be the most practical.
What is the overlap between crypto systems and voting?
Yeah, great question. Cryptography is a way of securing many aspects of a system. I mean, the usual goals of integrity and confidentiality and availability are there in a voting system as well. And confidentiality is sort of the classic goal to which one might apply cryptography. And integrity as well. You can have digital signatures to give you integrity. And so many current voting system designs from the academic world use cryptography to provide some confidentiality and some integrity. So cryptography is a tool towards the end of voting system design. And voting systems are challenging because of the secret ballot, because certain things have to remain confidential, even to an extent beyond what most, say, banking systems need to have.
Yeah.
So it's
David, you explained that on this new Screensavers that banking has one need that it is somewhat different from balloting. But let me go back to the beginning, because 83, or first presidential election, piece of paper. Did you have There was no election, actually. Washington was by acclamation. Let's go to the next one. You had a piece of paper, and did you have the names of the candidates on there, and you check one, and then you fold it, you hand it in, right? That's kind of what we think of as voting. What's wrong with that system?
Well, I don't really know how elections worked in 1790.
Actually, I don't either. I realized.
I read a little bit about the history of elections, and the really interesting event was in the late 19th century when the Australian secret ballot system was adopted. In most of the 1800s, voting was not a very private matter. So individual political parties would print up ballots, sometimes with very weird colors and shapes. So you could tell when somebody walked into the polling place which party they were going to vote for, and this led to a lot of bribery and coercion of voters. And so the system was so corrupt that at some point we went to our extreme secret ballot system that we have right now.
So that's relatively recent, that notion that who you're voting for is a private matter, but that only you should know who you voted for.
It may have been true in principle, but it became true in reality once we started getting serious about secret ballots.
Right.
And so that's the paper-based system that people are familiar with, where you fill out a ballot in a private voting booth and you put it, you fold it or something and put it in a ballot box. And then after that, nobody knows who cast that particular ballot.
Right.
That's actually the property.
This is Ron. I was going to add, I think some of the earliest elections in the country were very public. You went up to the town square and you announced who you're voting to the recorder, and everybody could hear. So it was the secret ballot, as David said, came in later in the 19th century.
But I presume the publicness of it at that time was to verify the count. In other words, the issue is, well, who's going to count these secret ballots, and can we trust that person? If you do it in public, at least everybody can stand there and say, well, I see you got more votes than them.
It's hard to tell what the considerations were at the time. It might have just been the easiest thing to do.
It may also have been that, yeah.
It's also, but I think you've got an important point that it's a very different system from the perspective of verifying the count. It makes it more trustworthy. The town hall situation where everybody votes in public, everybody gets to see how everybody else votes, and pretty much there's no question about who won unless it's a tie. The secret ballot it has a bunch of other advantages, but it poses a bunch of additional challenges. And one of the first things that people need to know is how different the secret ballot is from other systems we have where people may do things online,
right? Where
the transactions are all labeled with the people who participated in them.
Well, for instance, if you vote in a Twitter poll, your vote is associated with your Twitter account, and presumably whoever has that information, the logs, can identify who voted. So I think we should say what the criteria are today for a good voting system. And I think we've already pinpointed some of them, right? Your ballot should be private, right? So that you can't be coerced, you can't be bought. Only you should know who you voted for. In fact, that's been kind of an issue because people are starting to Snapchat and take Instagram pictures of their ballot. I see it a lot on Facebook now.
Yes, that's an issue.
And it's technically illegal in some states because that would be what the information you'd need to provide to somebody who's buying your vote. I want to give you $10 to vote for my guy. You'd have to prove to them that you did that, so you'd take a picture of the ballot. So, in fact, that is illegal. So that's one thing. We want an anonymity. But at the same time, we only want one person, one vote, right? So we have to somehow verify that you're voting once and only once. And then we also have to have some means of trust in the counting so that we know that the vote is recorded accurately, and when the results are announced, that they are accurate results. Are there other... That seems to be three. What other criteria?
Well, there's other things. I mean, there's certainly eligibility. The people who are voting are those who are eligible to vote and so on. The way I like to put it, and from the security viewpoint, is the two major requirements are accuracy. The count should be correct, and producing evidence for the losers to know that they lost fair and square.
Right.
We've got a transfer of power system in this country that's based on the democratic principles of free and fair elections, and so you have to have evidence that the transfer of power is going to the right person, sufficient to convince the loser and his supporters or her supporters that the outcome was what it was announced. And that's a high bar. That's in fact a much higher bar than say for banking transactions, or you want to count donations to American Red Cross or something. You're really dealing with a very important situation here, and and you're dealing with very skeptical audience. Perhaps the loser and his supporters may feel that they were fooled somehow, and so you need to provide persuasive evidence that the count was accurate, and that's something that's very difficult to do with computer systems. Computers are great at counting. They're terrible at producing evidence. Paper ballots are one way to rectify that.
Yeah, and of course this is timely because one of the candidates in our current presidential election has already started saying it's a rigged election, and it's really important that we understand whether that's possible and whether the proper steps are being taken to make sure that the election is fair, result is fair.
I think it's interesting to contrast some recent and older statements about elections. So the recent quote I heard from Donald Trump was, "I'll accept the results of the election if I win."
Yeah.
And that's the
not very
opposite.
Reassuring.
That's the opposite of what Ron is talking about.
Right. If I
which
lose,
is that
right.
If I lose, I have to accept it. So he took the easy way.
Yeah.
The hard way, there's a quote from the 60s from a congressional candidate in California where his concession speech was, "The people have spoken, the bastards." And I like that quote.
That's
because
great.
it captures the idea that you don't have to believe that
You don't have to
the voters
like
did the right thing. You don't have to like it, but you have to accept it.
And that's fair. That's fair. Usually we expect graceful concession speeches, but it doesn't.
No.
And in fact, and this is something it's also been emphasized since then, that there's no legal requirement that a candidate must concede. But what's really important is that the electorate trusts the results of the ballot.
That's correct. Yeah, and so having paper ballots with a post-election audit system to review the ballots, just to do a statistical check on them is probably the best practice of the day. So you can have it. You can make the ballots available. Some states allow recounts on demand, so the losing candidate can request that the paper ballots be recounted. The losing candidate may have to pay for the recount, but the ballots are there, and he can confirm that the outcome is what he was told. So recounts and post-election audits allow the evidence trail, which is the paper ballots that were collected, to be confirmed as giving the right outcome.
Yeah. As with everything else, once the information revolution started to happen, we just assumed everything would be replaced by electronic means, that computers would take over for everything. I think 15, 20 years ago it was a common assumption that, we're going to have online voting and so forth. What's the problem? Why can't we have reliable electronic elections?
I think let's talk about internet voting. So the first thing is what we've really talked about already, that elections are different from other things, and in fact the requirement of ballot secrecy is the thing that really makes them different from other things. So that's really what makes it difficult. So if you imagine you're doing internet voting and you're voting on your PC, but there's a virus there, that can log a keylogger and something that can change a ballot before it gets sent out over the internet, you can see exactly how difficult it would be to make a trustworthy internet voting system.
Yeah. Difficult, but is it not impossible, or?
There's an issue of trust here, and that goes a couple of ways. I mean, with a paper ballot system, you are directly marking the record of evidence, and you can verify that it's what it says. Yeah. With any electronic system, you're dealing with a proxy, a computer system that's acting as you and voting for you. Your PC is voting for you, or the website is voting for you, and so you've got an intermediary there who is voting for you effectively. And the question is, why should you trust that system to be accurate and not to just fool you? And that's a very, very challenging problem. We don't know how to do that yet. Someday, in 20, 30 years, we may have voting systems. You can vote over your phone, trustworthy way. But at the moment, we don't know how to make these proxies secure.
So Ron is one of the people who's made significant contributions to cryptographic voting, and he and his students. And there are some very clever things that have been done in that field with some very nice properties. There are still some unsolved problems, and the problem is that people are talking about deploying internet voting now. In fact, it's in use in a few states for overseas voters. And the technology is just not ready. It might be ready at some future point, although that requires some research breakthroughs. So, yeah.
People who remember the 2000 election remember the phrase hanging chads, and I think may be skeptical, in fact, of a paper ballot system because, as you remember, watching the Florida election officials kind of, what was the intent of this ballot? And apparently there were quite a few ballots where that was in question. And so you would think an electronic system would be more robust.
One of the issues, the distinctions between a paper ballot system and electronic system is the distinction between what I like to call wholesale fraud and retail fraud. With a paper system, you can do attacks on one ballot at a time. Maybe you can erase a mark, you can put in a new mark, you can cause an overvote or something like that. But it's one at a time kind of fraud, and it's expensive for an adversary to try to mount that kind of an attack. Whereas an electronic system, all the records are electronic, and a simple little script that anybody could write could change all of the votes in a district or a state even quite quickly. So electronic records are so fragile, so easily manipulable. That was what gives them their power and why we use them all the time, because they are easy to manipulate. But manipulating them in an evil sense is the concern we have for voting, and electronic records are just so vulnerable.
So you made a distinction, David, between... Go ahead,
I want to mention paper. Really, punch card ballots have a terrible reputation, and they did have a terrible reputation before Florida. They were well known to be a truly lousy voting system because of the hanging chads and many other problems. People make mistakes when they're voting on the things because typically the little holes are just numbered and they have to match up the candidates to the numbers.
And that was one of the problems of Florida. The ballot was very the butterfly ballot was very confusing.
I talked to election officials who said they had used punch card ballots and gotten rid of them a decade before Florida was still using them, before 2000, because they were just so awful. So that, while we like paper ballots, we don't like punch card ballots because security is not so much the issue as the other problems with accurately recording the vote. Right. Now, when you're talking about the prevalent voting system in the U.S., which is optical scan ballots. It's like a standardized exam where you fill out the ballot to get scanned by computer. The votes are counted by computer, but you can go back and count either all of the ballots or some of the ballots to make sure that the computer's counts are correct. That's a very good system. Voters don't make very many errors on that system, and you don't have the problems of hanging chads because you don't punch holes in the ballots.
That's how I just voted in California, and that's how we vote in this county. In most of the counties in California, you get a long card that it looks like one of those exams you're used to with the number 2 pencils. You mark the candidates and the initiatives, your vote in each of those, and you pack it in an envelope, tear it off. It's now anonymous. It's within an envelope that has your signature on it. I guess they get it back at the election counting place, wherever the registrar, and then they open up the envelope. That's discarding the identifying material, right?
Exactly right.
And then they have an anonymous packet, which is now fed to the machine for counting, but they preserve the paper ballot for auditing purposes or recounts. Is that all accurate, what I just described?
Yes, that's very correct.
And that seems to be the best way to do it right now?
What you described is vote by mail. So in California, it's still common for people to vote in polling places as well.
Same thing would happen in a polling place. I would sign the book.
They mark the same kind of ballot, but they put it into a scanner or they put it into a ballot box at the poll.
In fact, I could even do that with my vote by mail. I'd once again identify myself, not with an ID, but just go in and say, yes, that's me, and sign the book, and then place that same exact ballot envelope into a box.
The level of authentication you need varies from state to state. In Massachusetts, there's no need to sign the book at all. I remember my son went to vote for the first time, and he was shocked that he didn't need to produce a driver's license or sign anything even. He just had to sort of assert who he was. And so that's a political decision as to what level of authentication one needs for voters.
Well, we should address that because, of course, that's also on the table is this issue of identifying and authenticating voters, voter ID.
Right.
And in many states now where that was proposed, it's been overturned because it's seen as a barrier to voting.
Yeah, I'm happy with the Massachusetts system myself. Actually, I think that there's very little fraud going on, and if there were a visible level of fraud going on, then maybe an increased level of identification would be needed. I think my own ideal system would be something where they pop up a picture when you show up there saying, "This is what you look like the last time you voted," and they check to see if you look the same.
That would raise those issues of privacy once again, though, right?
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this is a political question. It's not so much a technical question as to what level of ID is important. important. And I think the issues of voter suppression by requiring unreasonable amounts of voter ID is a very real one.
Especially, and I don't want to get political here, but I have a bias in this, but especially since there is so little recorded evidence of voter fraud, you're fixing a problem that doesn't exist. Go ahead, David.
So from a computer or from a security issue,
that's how we should address it. Yeah, yeah.
So there's been way too much attention on quote voter fraud. So the difference between voter fraud and election fraud is that voter fraud is election fraud committed by individual voters.
That's so-called retail fraud.
The notion that you're going to have hundreds of people voting when they shouldn't, or enough voters voting when they shouldn't, or voting multiple times to actually sway an election is just very, very unlikely. If you were a bad person and you wanted to steal an election and you went through your list of possible ways to do it and prioritized by the likelihood of working,
and not getting caught.
Yes. So there are kinds of election fraud that could be committed by relatively few people, which might not be detected at all. And so having thousands or tens of thousands of people showing up at polling places and voting when they shouldn't is, each individual vote counts for almost nothing, and each voter is committing a felony. It's just insane to imagine that.
A high barrier with a low payoff.
It's almost laughable.
And
so
yet we hear
a voting machine company.
But we hear. I mean, first of all, one of the things that maybe tips it a little bit in the other direction is the nature of voting for the president in the United States. Because of these swing states, the Electoral College, very few voters can, in fact, influence a very big election. And we hear stories of 1960 and Kennedy and voter fraud in Chicago's perhaps swinging the Kennedy-Nixon election. So I think that's why that's in our consciousness.
But even in those cases, we're talking about, probably hundreds of thousands of votes and say Florida 2000 was extremely close.
Right.
And
if you could have swung 1,000 votes in Florida, you might have changed the result of the election.
Yeah, depending on how ultimately it was counted, but that's true. But even 1,000 illegal votes in a situation that is that close, that gets that kind of scrutiny, is very risky. And then, unless you know in advance that it's going to be that close, how many people are you going to bother sending into the polling place to vote illegally?
Right. In fact, a recent study said that counting 1 billion votes cast in the U.S., there were 31 documented cases of voter fraud. It's not common at all.
It's a lot of smoke here.
Yeah. All right. So, but that is a crypto issue. That's the issue of authentication, I guess, right? Of proving that you are a legitimate voter and that it is you voting and you're voting once and only once.
So you need to have some political standards set to say what level of authentication is required based on the experience with fraud and this.
You could do perfect authentication, but it would be considered a barrier, perhaps, to voting.
I'm not even sure what that would consist of.
Yeah.
There's no perfect anything,
fingerprint,
unfortunately,
Face ID,
in our world.
Two-factor authentication.
I mean, the other trade-off is how much inconvenience are you going to cause the voters, and how many people are going to be disenfranchised.
Right.
And I'm somebody that I have to show my ID regularly. I fly and that sort of thing. But it turns out that there's a significant population of people in the U.S. who don't. They don't fly, they don't drive, and they don't need to have an ID normally, except to vote. In some of the states that have voter ID requirements, it's quite difficult for people. It's quite inconvenient for them to get the IDs, and it costs money. So it becomes a barrier.
Yeah.
Another aspect that relates to this, if I can interject, is the whole voter registration database, right? If you've got any sort of biometric system or other kind of a database for authentication, or even just the list of names of the voters, right? That's a vulnerable computer system that could be hacked before the election. You could imagine going to the polls and finding out you're no longer registered to vote, and you don't know how that happened. And that's one of the concerns that people have been talking about quite a bit recently is the vulnerability of these voter registration databases.
So about 10 years ago, there was a very good documentary on HBO called Hacking Democracy, and it was addressing the issue of electronic voter fraud and targeting particularly these Diebold voting machines that were starting to become popular in the States. What happened there? And are those machines still being used?
Basically what happened is around the time that documentary came out, laws were being passed in many states to prevent the use of those types of machines, and they were gotten rid of in a number of places. So in our state, in California, we went through a series of secretaries of state, starting with Kevin Shelley and going on to Deborah Bowen, who scrutinized the use of electronic voting machines in California, and the end result is you're voting on paper ballots.
Yeah.
There are 2 counties in California that have.
Wow.
Yeah, well, they were basically administratively ruled illegal. There are 2 counties in California that still use electronic voting, but both of those counties have machines that print a copy of the ballot, and the voter approves that and before they leave the polling place. So what's happening now is that, one thing that people need to understand is how fragmented the American system is. So we have different equipment in virtually every county of the United States. Sometimes there are statewide voting systems. And many states, including the most populous ones, New York and California, have voting systems where there are paper ballots that can be, so the buzzword we use is voter verified. So it's possible for the voter to check the contents of the paper ballot before the ballot is cast. However, some states don't have this. Georgia, for example, is all electronic. Pennsylvania, which is an important swing state in this election, has a lot of electronic voting machines with no paper trails whatsoever. And the hope is that pretty soon, these things being computers, they will age out. And I think there's not a lot of enthusiasm for manufacturing or buying electronic voting systems in the United States. So we're hoping that over time, those systems will be replaced by paper ballot systems.
We were just looking at a map on the website that you created, verifiedvoting.org, a nonprofit, nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to this topic. And what are DREs on this map?
A DRE is a direct recording electronic machine. So it's could be a touchscreen machine. Sometimes they have other interfaces like a knob that you rotate or buttons as you push, but it's something where the votes are entered electronically.
And there's no paper record.
Are those the machines that we're concerned about?
Yes, we're also concerned about electronic voting, but DREs were really where both Ron and I got involved.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ron. I'm sorry we interrupted you.
No, I was just answering the simple question. DREs have an electronic record only. They're concerned because there's no voter verifiable paper record. You don't know that what's recorded is what you intended, and they're subject to programming errors or fraud in the voting machine. They're very difficult to ascertain that what you've got at the end is really what should be the right result.
A variety of hacks were demonstrated on the Diebold machines. Those Diebold machines were DRE, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so there's one hack where you could show a vote being recorded and it was automatically decremented at the same time, and all sorts of ways. And this was because were they internet connected? How did you hack a machine like that?
Most of them are not internet connected. So your viewers may be interested in going to YouTube and Googling Diebold voting machine, Ed Felten, Felten, because he was a professor, still is, I guess, at Princeton, and his students spent months hacking one of these machines. So they bought one somehow, and then they started working on it, and by the end of this process, they had ways of transferring viruses to and from the machines from the central server, where a voter could toss. There we go.
Yeah.
Toss a voter card. These things work with little smart cards, credit card size things, into the pile and infect machines with viruses, which could infect the other voter cards, which eventually would go back to the central server. That's called an election management system, and infect it. And the next election, it could infect all the rest of the machines. Sadly,
of course, the DMCA limited what Professor Felton could do because it became illegal to reverse engineer machines. I imagine Diebold liked that. They're out of that business though now, aren't they?
Well, I think I don't know the details of the DMCA, but there are exemptions for research, and he's a researcher, and people who do that kind of work also talk to lawyers first.
Yes,
and so I'm sure that he was on solid ground.
Ed has absolutely done that, but he's complained considerably about this limitation. He believes in the freedom to tinker. as he calls it. In fact, I think there's a website, freedomtotinker.com.
Yeah, it's an excellent website.
Excellent. Yeah, it's very good.
There should be a freedom to tinker, and it's talking there. He is talking about Diebold's response to his desire to reverse engineer the Diebold machine. But that sounds like that is we've averted that disaster, or for the most part averted that disaster. And the key was, you said, a paper trail.
A paper trail is essential to having a voter.
That seems so retro.
Yeah, I mean, I often get people saying, you're from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it should be very high tech, right? And
right.
You're recommending this low tech solution, but it's not often. It's not sometimes the case that low tech is the best solution, right? You got less complexity. Security is often a matter of the least complicated system you can have, right? The more complexity you've got, the more vulnerabilities are going to be. Paper is so simple, so it just hits the sweet spot and allows the voter to verify their choices are recorded properly very easily, and then the counting can be automated and checked statistically afterwards. So it's a good system.
I think a good engineer is not a mindless cheerleader for the use of technology in all applications.
Right.
It really has to be the best technology for the job at hand, and that is not necessarily the most sophisticated technology.
Sometimes pen and paper.
Absolutely.
Are there actually voting machines today connected to the internet? That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
I think maybe the answer is no. There used to be, until recently, there were some systems called the WinVote in Virginia, and they weren't actively connected to the internet, but they had wireless networking, which opens up a whole lot of security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, no kidding.
There are some states that allow remote voters, such as military voters, to cast votes by email or the like, which definitely uses the internet.
Right. We're talking with Ron Rivest, who is, of course, the legendary R in RSA and RC, a crypto expert and professor at MIT, on sabbatical now and in Berkeley. We're glad to have you out here on the West Coast. Also from the West Coast, from Stanford, David Dill. He is a professor, the Donald E. Knuth Professor of Engineering and, by courtesy, I like that, of Electrical Engineering at Stanford. It's great to have you both on the show. We're going to take a little break, come back with more on triangulation in just a moment. I want to mention, I know you watch this show because you're a learner, a lifelong learner. I think we all are. At least I hope we all are. And I found a really great channel for those of us who like to learn. You like documentaries, right? Well, it's called Curiosity Stream. It's the world's first ad-free, non-fiction streaming service. It was created by the guy who did the Discovery Channel, John Hendricks. And it's very affordable. It's got lots of stuff you're going to love to watch. 1,500 documentaries, 600 hours of content, over 50-plus hours of 4K content. So if, like me, you just got a 4K TV and you're looking for something to watch, this is a great solution. And it's available pretty much worldwide, 196 countries, on the web, but also Roku supports it. There's a Roku app. There are Android apps, Android TV apps, iOS apps, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and there's an Apple TV app as well. I just got the new 4K Roku. So this is exactly what I'm looking for, to load up on 4K content, including things like Stephen Hawking's Favorite Places, which is a brand new documentary. You got Hawking in a CGI spaceship flying across the universe, stopping at Saturn and other destinations, talking about his favorite places in the universe. I love it. Digits, it's a new 3-part series hosted by the creator of YouTube's Science Channel. You've all seen Veritasium, right? Derek Muller's amazing. It explores something that I know we're all interested in, online safety and security, and has interviews with, never seen before interviews with Edward Snowden and Vint Cerf, one of my favorite guys in the world. So this is another one. I also have bookmarked Deep Time History. It's a 3-part documentary that tells the story of the universe's 14 billion year history, and Underwater Wonders of the National Parks. Gosh, I hope that one's in 4K. It's it's the centennial of the National Park Service, right? And maybe you didn't know, but there are massive bodies of water in the national parks, and this is a 7-part series that takes you below the surface. All of this very affordable. They have monthly plans, annual plans, starting at just $2.99 a month. And we're talking less than a single title on some of those paste services, less than a cup of coffee. CuriosityStream, I think you're going to love it. Go to curiositystream.com/twit and use the promo code TWIT during sign up to get unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and nonfiction series, and it's free, and the 2-month trial is a pretty good deal. Now, I got an email from somebody who said, wait a minute, it wasn't 2 months, I just got a month. But they apply the second month later, so don't get freaked out when you sign up. Just make sure you use the offer code TWIT, and you'll get those 60 days. One of the largest nonfiction 4K libraries anywhere. CuriosityStream.com/twit. You know what's great about 4K? It looks great on 2K too. CuriosityStream.com/twit. Our show today is a timely show. We don't. A lot of times, what we do on Triangulation is timeless. We talk about the big topics, but here we're applying the big topics of authentication, crypto, security, privacy, to something very specific and very timely: elections. And of course, we are 1 week out from a national election, and one of the candidates has said it's rigged. And so one of the questions I have for our guests, Ron Rivest and David Hill, is about rigging elections. David, you've said that one of the advantages we have in this country is that our voting system is a crazy quilt. It's so heterogeneous.
Sometimes it's a plus and sometimes it's a minus. You know, if you want to improve the voting system, it takes a long time and you have to persuade 50 states and maybe 5,000 counties to do it. And but
Wow.
if there's a bad idea, it's slow to be adopted. So we could have had the whole country go to electronic voting in 2002, but we didn't because each county had to make the decision separately.
And it makes it more difficult to do wholesale voter fraud because you have to go county by county, and it's a variety of different means you'd have to use.
I think that's true. Yeah.
David founded a group called Verified Voting at verifiedvoting.org, which talks about this and may answer some of your questions, and features a video by Zachary Quinto on how to hack an election, which I haven't watched yet, but I will have to watch it. Would it be hard to hack an election?
I think it'd be pretty hard. Yeah. There's, as David said, there's many different systems there. The paper records that are mostly used around the country would mean that you'd have to have not only electronic access, but have some access to the physical paper records. Yeah. And so with a good chain of custody of the paper records, the election would be hard to hack. Assuming that the paper records are referred to, I think one of the places where we still have to do our homework a bit better is in the post-election audit area. So we have the paper records. They are the definitive record of how the voters voted. We've got an electronic count. If the electronic count were erroneous somehow, we'd want to be able to detect that. And really the best way of detecting that is to have a statistical sample of the paper ballots and to compare that with the electronic records.
Is that done now?
It's done in a number of places. We're doing it more and more, but we're not doing it as much as we should.
Kind of just a sampling just to see how close you came and if you saw a problem. Right now,
and to really audit the machines, to double check the
Right.
machine counts, because they could be in error because of some configuration problem, software bug, or
Sure.
because of tampering with the machines.
Sure. I mean, I guess we should add a fourth criterion to this list, which is probably part of the problem, which is speedy results. We're in a hurry now. We want to know right away what happened.
Yeah, that is a problem, and there are lots of cases that need to be looked at. There are voters who have to vote provisionally, for example. That's one of the big reasons why things are slow. A voter comes to the poll site. Their identification credentials are dubious, or somehow their name isn't on the voting list. And the standard procedure is for the voter to be allowed to vote, but their ballot is put in a paper envelope and put aside with the name and some indication of how they identified themselves. And then later those ballots are looked at, but there's a one-by-one process. They have to check them and say, well, maybe this voter did move and their address should have been here, and therefore they should have been allowed to vote, and so on. So there's a process that's gone through. So that's one thing that slows things down.
Yeah.
But in a case where the margin is large, it doesn't matter too much. You you can have a preliminary result that's based on the count of those that were easy to verify. But the actual certified tally is going to take some time.
Yeah, if it's a landslide, none of these issues really come up, right? It's presumed that if you won by, say, 6 or 7%, that even if there were some issues, it wouldn't be enough to change the result of the election. It's the close election that becomes a problem.
There's a saying that says the election official's prayer is, let it be a landslide.
Yeah, yeah. What is the percentage
So
where you would feel some confidence statistically that there couldn't be any error in the result?
I'm always skeptical. I'd like to see the checks afterwards.
No matter what.
Yeah, I think even with a landslide victory, otherwise, somebody could rig the election to make it look like a landslide when it wasn't. So
sure.
You've got the polls ahead of time. So, you're right. If it's a landslide.
Although we've seen polls be very, very wrong. In fact, in the Brexit election, the result was quite a surprise. And some are comparing this to Brexit, this current election.
I think there's no reason not to do a post-election audit, even if it's a landslide. If it is a landslide, the post-election audit will be very efficient. You'll look at 50 or 100 votes selected at random, and you'll see that they go the same way. And you say, "Yep, that's enough to give me statistical confidence."
So it can be done quickly and easily with just a handful of votes.
So one of the important things that we need to do about elections in the places that have paper ballots is not only put in place auditing where it doesn't exist, but start using better auditing, more efficient auditing methods. And by efficient, what I mean is something where you don't have to count very many ballots in most cases in order to be quite confident that there's no significant error in the election. And so sometimes these are called risk limiting audits. And since Ron is actively working on this and I'm not, I think maybe we could put him on the spot and see if he could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. The question is, what do you want to do when the election's over? How do you want to audit the ballots? And so the main ingredients are, first of all, having paper ballots to look at, and then having some statistical procedure to select, say, ballots one at a time at random, and a process then for deciding, do I need to keep looking at more ballots, or can I stop here with enough statistical confidence? And the math behind that is basically statistics and sequential decision-making kind of analysis, and that's pretty well understood. And as David says, they can be quite efficient, and the number of ballots you look at goes up as the election gets closer and closer. In a very, very close election, you might have to look at everything, and that's actually not surprising. But in most elections, you just have to look at maybe 50, 100, a few hundred votes or a few thousand votes, depending on the process you're using and the closeness of the election.
And that is, as I remember from 2000, that can be triggered by the closeness of the election. Sometimes statutorily, you forces a recount. Sometimes a candidate can request it, but again, it's different state by state and even county by county.
It's a legal distinction in many states between a post-election audit and a recount. A recount is sort of a formal procedure which counts all of the ballots and gives you the correct result for that recount. And the audit is sort of a confirmation procedure and doesn't necessarily have the legal authority to overturn the result, even though it may indicate that it was wrong. So there's a bit of a distinction there between the notions of a recount and an audit.
Would you like to see legislation requiring an audit and then having requiring a recount based on the results of that audit? Would that be the way to handle it?
Yeah, I think the way a good system would work would be to have an audit which escalates the size of the sample you're looking at if it's close, and if it's showing a different result than the announced result, and proceeding all the way to looking at all the ballots and calling that full examination a recount at that stage. You don't need to go back and then count them again, but just having the escalation to a full recount if necessary. So that would be what I would like to see, and legislation supporting that would be great.
Yeah,
it's important to have these things clearly spelled out, have really good procedures, but also have the rules clearly spelled out, because once an election's over and a preliminary winner has been announced, of course, as we've seen, it gets extremely political, and every argument and bit of propaganda gets pulled out that can. So if the election officials can look at the rule book and say, this is what we're supposed to do, then it makes the process go more smoothly and makes it more fair ultimately.
And eliminates the need to go to the Supreme Court to get a decision.
Yes, and helps deal with the angry supporters who end up losing eventually.
Right, and that's kind of critical. I mean, an election, you need to have faith in the result even if you lose. And that's really the goal here. One of our chatters, the Gem Doctor, is reminding me that in 2008 there were some errors in that was Diebold. Now they're called Premier Voting Solutions, something like that, in the machines used in the primary there. And Diebold blamed the antivirus software from McAfee for the error. That's scary in itself. The voting machine was running antivirus software?
Yeah, it says GEMS in there, which is this is the server. This is the election management server. And
okay. So it's a computer.
It is a little scary.
It's a Windows machine, I presume. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Typically. Yeah.
Maybe we could require that they not be using Windows XP, at least something like that. Wow. Those are the bad old days 8 years ago, right? It's all much better now.
I would say
it's incrementally better.
A little better.
The number of states using paper ballots has gone up, and David takes a lot of credit for that with the founding of verified voting and his continual advocacy for paper ballots. And I think that's been a success. We've seen so many states turn over to paper ballots, and for good reason.
David, who do you contact if you want to write to your? Is it your assemblyman, your state assembly, your county officials, the state registrar of voters? Who do you write to if you want to change the way things are done in your state?
I think you have to go to the legislature in most cases.
Okay.
So every state is different. You can find out the details of what goes on in your state, at least the types of equipment that are used on the verified voting website. But ultimately, a lot of these problems are legislative problems. So
write to your state legislator and say, hey.
Yeah, I mean, you really need to know what specifically is going on in your state. If you're going to these are things I've learned about politics after getting involved in this, that what you really need is a vehicle, some law that's been proposed, and then you can start urging people to support that in the legislature. Sometimes there are things that can be done administratively by the Secretary of State's office, but you need to know what you're asking for.
Right. More coming up in just a second on elections. Boy, this is a great topic. And it's really a deep topic, much more so than I had realized. Our show today, though, brought to you by, I'm excited about this, the all-new Basecamp 3. Did you see my interview a few weeks ago on the show with David Heinemeier Hansen, creator of Basecamp and Ruby on Rails? Basecamp has just been updated. He was, he didn't mention this. He's very smart. He'd obviously been working on Basecamp 3. If you've ever tried Basecamp before, I was blown away when I saw Basecamp 3. What is Basecamp? Well, it's a private, secure space online for your team where you can stay organized, you can communicate, you can get the job done. And we all know email is a terrible way to do that. Chat, frankly, isn't either, but Basecamp has everything you need, including, of course, message boards and chat, but you also get file storage, schedules, automatic check-ins, to-dos. They've really updated. This is the new home screen, and they've really updated it. It's just fantastic. Jason Fried, who, along with David, created, it was originally 37 Signals. Remember, they changed the name to Basecamp, their most popular product a few years ago. The thing I love about it, the pricing is so great, and you don't pay per user. So you don't ever have that bad feeling, which I've had, where you say, I don't want to add another user. It's going to cost me more. No, you don't worry about it. Everybody can be involved, as many people as you need, not just inside your company, but outside, too, because you have total control. If you want to add a client to what they see, they don't see everything, just what you let them see. And that you just don't have to worry about expensive software licenses. It's very affordable. We just started using Basecamp for our live events staff. So they have a lot to coordinate, if you think about it, planning to execution. Colleen loves it. She says very intuitive, gives you a great visual overview, easy to assign tasks and track how the tasks are getting done. You know what happens, and this happened to our company too, is when you're a small company, when you're 5 people, remember those days, John, when you're just a handful of people, it's easy to stay in touch with everybody and know what everybody's up to. You're talking all the time. But as the company gets big, and I think it's about 20 people, you start losing track of who's doing what. And it just adds to your anxiety, your tension. Basecamp, in fact, the whole company at Basecamp is about relaxing, taking control, not having the anxiety, the worries, just knowing things are get done. They even have, I love this, it's just an example. You can set up notifications, tell them when your work hours are, and you won't be bugged, right? Nobody on your team can bug you when you're off duty. It's just like you're in control. Make your workplace calmer, more productive. I love it. You will too. Basecamp.com/twit. Basecamp.com/twit. If you're on a team, if you're on a project, whether it's a nonprofit, a giant corporation, a little podcast network, join the 100,000 plus customers who use and love Basecamp. And the new Basecamp 3 is awesome. Basecamp.com/twit. Sign up today for a free trial. You're watching Triangulation. We're talking about elections and making elections more reliable so that both parties, in the case of a presidential election, can have some certainty that what happened was the will of the voters. And we couldn't have two better people to do this. Ron Rivest is here. He's a legend, of course, in the crypto world, professor of computer science at MIT, the creator of RSA and the Rivest cipher, or RC, of which there are many. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you, Dr. Rivest, on the show. His colleague David Dill is also here. David is a professor of computer science at Stanford and is the founder of Verified Voting, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization at verifiedvoting.org, which promotes the notion of a better electoral system, a better election system, not electoral, election system in the United States. The latest news, of course, is that the Department of Homeland Security has offered to help in the election, and 42 states have requested help. Let's talk, David, a little bit about this upcoming election, and what are your fears about this election? What are the things to watch out for? What should we be concerned about?
In terms of technology, the thing that I'm most worried about at the moment is somebody messing with the voter registration system in one or more states.
That's the most vulnerable at this point?
Well, yeah, and it's also something we can do the most about, right? So if we're worried about, we've already seen the U.S. government is accusing nation states of trying to hack the voter registration systems in several states. So we've already seen people trying to attack these systems. And
that's where the DHS is coming in, right, is to protect those systems.
Yeah. So they're talking about really rather straightforward measures that any corporation would use to try to protect its data, I think. And so before the election, we have to rely on election officials to try to maintain the security of those machines, and I hope they're being diligent. But there is one thing that voters can do, which is if it's possible to check your registration status online in your state, or even by calling your registrar of voters or whatever, do that. Make sure that you're registered and that your address and your information hasn't changed. Because if somebody had managed to mess with the voter registration system and change it so you're supposed to vote in a different precinct, that would be very troubling on election day.
Has there any evidence of this happening?
I don't know that there's any evidence of people actually changing these things. I'm worried about last-minute changes because of the fact that we already know that people have been attacking these systems.
So there have been probes against these registration databases.
Another thing you could do as a voter is just vote early in many states.
Yeah, I voted already. I am a permanent absentee ballot vote by mail voter, just because I think that's an easier way to vote. Actually, we're already seeing record numbers of votes being mailed in, which I presume is encouraging.
It's good that they're voting early. I have mixed feelings about the security of vote by mail because one of the issues you do worry about in a voting system is coercion, and we don't know that your spouse wasn't coercing you to vote a certain way, or
she was actually, but I ignored her entreaties.
Good for you. Or your employer may say, let's all get together for lunch and bring your ballots and we'll vote.
Oh man. Yeah,
something like that, or a nursing home. Everybody gets together. So it's not supervised voting, and I think there's a security plus for having a supervised voting scenario. So I'm still a fan of poll site voting.
Interesting. That's actually a great point that I hadn't thought about. Does the DHS have the tools to do this? Is it pen testing? What kind of things do they do?
Yeah, pen testing is probably one of the top things they do. Look for just all of the computer systems that are dealing with any of the sensitive vote information and making sure that they're locked down and inaccessible from the internet.
And David, you said that we already have detected probes by nation states?
Yeah. This has been in the newspaper that the Arizona, I believe, voter registration system has been attacked, and it could be that people are just downloading information.
Right. Which would be the typical goal of a hacker, to get personal information. But lately, there's been some concern about Russia and other nation states getting involved in our electoral system. Do you think that that seems like it would be a difficult way to manipulate an election?
Well, if you wanted to influence U.S. foreign policy, then having some influence in the election would certainly be a good way to do that. And I don't want to point fingers at Russia or whatever, but our elections are extremely valuable, right? Control of the the most powerful office in the world, basically, is the U.S. presidency. But even at the county level in California, the decisions get made that affect, say, land use or whatever for hundreds of millions of dollars. So the stakes can be very high. And it would be foolish for us to think of election security as being less vital than, say, protecting valuables in a jewelry store or something like that.
It's also the case that, and I've heard it expressed many times, that a country like Russia may have its goal not influencing the outcome, but influencing the credibility of the election system per se.
Yeah,
just undermining confidence in the election system. So the more you can throw up, uncertainty and doubt about whether the results are right, whether the system is really doing what it's supposed to do, you're undermining the foundations of our democracy, and that's really a concern. And I think a country like Russia might be happy to see, democracy take a hit. Just in terms of the credibility of its voting system. Sure. And you raised an issue which I hadn't really thought about, but of course, on every ballot, local ballot, there are issues that developers might have an interest in, companies, entire industries might have an interest in, and so there is some significant financial incentive if you could manage to do it. It would be pretty hard to do. I mean, merely moving somebody's location. Would that invalidate their vote if they were voting in the wrong location? Yeah, if you're, in general, laws vary from place to place. But if you go to a polling place and there are offices that are unique to that precinct, and so you have to be in the right precinct in general. So I worked as a poll worker, and I've had to send people to other precincts because they showed up at the wrong place in California. Of course, it's difficult to determine whether you're discouraging the right voter or the wrong voter, although I guess with gerrymandering and we've gotten pretty good at figuring out from location what people. Well, so suppose you download voter registration data, the party affiliation. Some people are independents, but a lot of people are marked as Democrats or Republicans. So you can tell. And then in some of these systems, people can change their own registration. It asks for confirming information like your age and your address and this sort of thing. But that information is the kind of things that people would have downloaded when they downloaded information from the voter registration system. In California, we get a postcard a month or two before the election verifying your voting details. I presume that that's an intent to make sure that the voter database is accurate. Yeah. It's not so much a security measure. I don't think it was intended that way, as people just make mistakes or they don't keep their registration up to date, or they. One problem in many states is that voter registration goes through the DMV. So when you get a driver's license, it automatically gives you the option of sending in voter registration. But sometimes the DMV makes mistakes and they don't forward that information, so people think they're registered when they aren't. I've had students in my class. I've taught a class in voting, and I've demanded the students all check their registration status, and usually there's at least one student who is not registered when they thought they were because of the DMV thing. Wow. That's the difference between the U.S. and other countries, I think. And in many other countries, the burden of responsibility of having the registration change automatically when you move is on the state, not the individual. In the U.S., it's the individual's responsibility to make sure he's registered to vote where he wants to be registered, whereas in some countries, it sort of follows you automatically. Let's design now that actually, before we do this, I'm going to have you design the perfect voting system. But before we do that, I want to reiterate the question: is there anything we should watch for on November 8th? Is there anything that you would consider a warning sign? Is there any way we can know that there is an issue? Well, issues where there, I would look for states where there's no paper trail and where the election's very close.
And those are three states that we know of, right?
Yeah. So
those states are what? Say it again. Georgia,
parts of Pennsylvania.
There you go.
I'm not sure what other.
There's
Florida has some bad voting systems.
Okay. So there's that.
Yeah,
there's
Pennsylvania
that
is the top of the list on almost everybody's list. Pennsylvania is the top of the list.
And because it's a major swing state.
Yes.
Yeah. There are states with Texas has a pretty bad voting system too, but it's not a swing state typically.
Right. All right. So that's a verifiedvoting.org. Great place to go to find out this kind of information. Let's design the perfect. Is there a perfect system?
There's no perfect system, but there is a lot of research on better voting systems. I'd like to point out one that's underway right now. Actually, it's the one that's called Star Vote. It's happening in Texas. What's her name? Clerk of Dana de Beauvoir is her name, but her office is she's clerk of the county of Travis County, which holds Austin, Texas, as one of its things. And that was designed by a number of people. It's based on paper ballots, but it also has some cryptography in there in nice ways. Yes, there we go. And it's in the process of being developed, and I think there's an RFP out now for it. But it has lots of very nice properties. For one thing, here's a property you may not have heard of. A voter can go after the election to a website and check that their vote was recorded properly. And that's a delicate.
I love that.
Yeah, it's nice. You go there and you just type in your name.
But you, of course, have to verify that because otherwise it's not a private vote.
So there's some cryptography used. So you can't use that mechanism to sell your vote. It's tricky. Okay. So your vote gets encrypted in a certain way, and you have to be looking at the encrypted vote.
How do they authenticate?
So it's a poll-side voting system. So you go there in person to vote. So it's not an online voting. This is only using the internet for after the election verification that your vote was cast properly, or not after the so you go on election day. You cast your paper ballot. It's scanned. Electronic record is made, and then there's a website that has an encrypted electronic version of that. Posted, and you can go and see, there's a vote recorded for you, and it's the vote that it should be, and it's done in a subtle cryptographic way that allows you to know that it's recording the right vote without allowing you to be able to sell it. So I think that's a very promising direction. I look forward to seeing that roll out successfully.
So my agenda would be go to precinct scanned. I like this STAR system as well, but if we go lower tech and use existing proven technology that doesn't require any research. What I'd love to see is across the United States, precinct scan optical scan ballots. So that's where you put your ballot in the polling place into a scanner, which counts the votes then and there, coupled with some of these better auditing systems that we've talked about. And then the very highest priority is to stop the deployment of systems that actually make the election system worse, right? So it's a sad thing that not only do we have to think about improving our voting system, we have to avoid doing things that unimprove it. And internet voting would be the very top of my list of things we shouldn't do.
So all the geeks watching, and this show, of course, is primarily for geeks, stop asking for online voting, internet voting. It's not a good idea. You can see it's really interesting, and I agree with you, David, when you said that if you're a serious technical person, you don't always vote for the most high-tech answer. Sometimes
the key thing there is the evidence. If you're a geek who wants to think about voting systems, the thing to think about is not only how do you make the counting accurate, but how do you make the evidence trail believable.
Right.
So you have to have some kind of evidence trail that is convincing to the loser that he lost fair and square. And if that evidence trail is produced by a corrupted computer, you've got a real problem.
Right. Travis County does allow early voting. Is that okay? Is that a good? I mean, it's still poll side, right?
That's fine with me.
Yeah. In fact, it's better because the whole notion of everybody voting all at once on a Tuesday is a kind of second Tuesday of November. It's kind of kooky.
I'd be in favor of a national holiday for voting.
There you go. Yeah.
You know, some people have to work hard on Tuesdays, and so I like the idea that they can vote early.
Yeah. So early voting, but it's poll side voting. They have a large population in Travis County, so this is a good test. They're going to use this STAR system this time around?
They're in the process of getting it. I think it's an RFP out, so they need to get manufacturers to produce it and so on.
So they still need the hardware to make this happen.
That's right.
But the work has been done, and there's a Usenix paper if people want to read up on this. STAR vote, a secure, transparent, auditable, and reliable voting.
So that's very interesting. I do agree with David's remarks, though, too, that getting most states, all counties to use precinct level optical scan is a great next step for all of us to be doing.
Yeah, and has the advantage of quick results as well.
Yes.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This is so important, and we're coming up on maybe one of the certainly most important election in my lifetime. David Dill is a professor of computer science at Stanford and the founder of Verified Voting, verifiedvoting.org if you want to know more and find out what your state, what your precinct is using and whether it's a good system. Ron Rivest is, of course, Ron Rivest, professor of computer science at MIT. Very, very well known in the crypto circles, and a guy we all have a lot to thank for his crypto systems. Thank you both for joining us today on Triangulation.
Thank you, Leo.
Great episode.
Thank you for having us.
Now let's all go vote.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, gentlemen. Take care. We do Triangulation every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 1800 UTC. I'd love it if you tune in live. Your questions, your comments in the chat room are always welcomed. Of course, you don't have to watch any of our shows live. On-demand audio and video of everything we do available on the web at twit.tv, in this case, twit.tv/TRI. And also, of course, wherever you subscribe to podcasts like iTunes or Stitcher or Slacker or Google. Anywhere you get your podcasts, that's where you'll find Triangulation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.